My ex-husband David faked his own death to avoid paying child support for our 8-year-old son Tyler. While I struggled to keep food on the table, he was living it up at a country club in Phoenix with his new girlfriend Kimberly. What he didn't realize was that his staged death had just given me the legal ammunition to destroy the comfortable new life he'd built on lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months after I'd buried my husband. Tyler was eating his usual breakfast of generic cereal while I sorted through the mail, mostly bills I couldn't afford, and credit card offers I'd never qualify for. The return address read, Henderson Life Insurance Company in professional blue lettering, and for a moment, I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe David's life insurance claim had finally been approved. Maybe Tyler and I could catch up on rent and buy groceries without counting every penny. I opened the envelope with hands that still shook slightly when I thought about finances. The single page inside contained exactly 11 words that would change everything. Claim denied due to fraudulent death certificate. Investigation ongoing. Contact immediately. My coffee mug slipped from my other hand and shattered against the kitchen floor, sending hot liquid splashing across my bare feet. Tyler looked up from his cereal with those wide brown eyes that reminded me so much of his father. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, in that careful voice children use when they sense adult problems they can't understand. I forced a smile and reached for paper towels, my mind racing through the impossible implications of what I'd just read. Fraudulent death certificate. The words felt foreign and terrifying. David had died in a motorcycle accident on Highway 101 just outside Riverside. The police report had been thorough. The funeral had been real. I'd watched his casket disappear behind the crematorium doors at Sunset Memorial Park. "I'm fine, sweetie," I lied, crouching to clean up the mess while my world quietly collapsed around me. "Just clumsy this morning." Tyler returned to his cereal, satisfied with my explanation, while I stared at the insurance letter and tried to process what fraudulent death certificate could possibly mean. The investigation had apparently been ongoing for months without my knowledge. Someone at Henderson Life Insurance had discovered something that made them question the validity of David's death. My hands trembled as I dialed the number printed at the bottom of the letter. The customer service representative who answered spoke with the practiced sympathy of someone who dealt with grieving widows regularly, but her tone shifted when I identified myself. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to transfer you directly to our fraud investigation department. Please hold." The generic elevator music that followed felt ominous rather than soothing. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Detective Carol Stevens with Henderson Life Insurance Fraud Division. I've been overseeing your husband's case for the past 3 months." Detective Stevens spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering potentially devastating news. During our routine investigation of the claim, several inconsistencies emerged that raised red flags about the validity of the death certificate and surrounding circumstances. The kitchen suddenly felt too small and too bright. I sat down heavily in one of our mismatched chairs, the same ones David had complained about replacing for years but never actually did anything about. "What kind of inconsistencies?" I managed to ask, though part of me already suspected I didn't want to know the answer. "The motorcycle that was supposedly involved in the accident was purchased with cash under a false name 3 days before the incident. The dental records used for identification don't match your husband's actual dental history. Most significantly, the body that was cremated appears to have been obtained from an unclaimed deceased person at the county morgue." Detective Stevens paused, letting the information sink in. "Mrs. Martinez, we have strong evidence suggesting that your husband staged his own death." The words hung in the air like smoke from the crematorium, where I thought I'd said goodbye to David forever. Staged his own death. The phrase seemed too dramatic for real life, something from a crime thriller, rather than my mundane existence in a cramped apartment in Riverside. But as Detective Stevens continued explaining their findings, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed began forming a picture I couldn't deny. David had been acting strange in the months before the accident. Late nights at work that hadn't resulted in overtime pay, unexplained cash transactions that he'd brushed off as business expenses, phone calls he'd taken in the garage, claiming they were about motorcycle parts or insurance quotes. I'd attributed his behavior to work stress and our ongoing financial struggles, never imagining he was orchestrating his own disappearance. Why would he do this? I asked, though even as the question left my mouth, I suspected I knew the answer. Our divorce had been finalized just 2 months before his supposed death. The child support payments had been substantial, nearly 40% of his monthly income. David had fought the amount viciously during the proceedings, arguing that it would leave him unable to maintain his standard of living. In cases like this, the motivation is typically financial. Detective Stevens confirmed. Court-ordered support payments, alimony, debt obligations. Staging death eliminates legal responsibilities while providing the opportunity to start fresh with a clean slate. The clinical way she described David's betrayal made it sound almost reasonable, a business decision rather than an act of abandonment against his own child. Tyler finished his cereal and brought his bowl to the sink, oblivious to the conversation that was rewriting his entire family history. "I'm gonna watch cartoons before school," he announced, and I nodded absently, still processing the revelation that his father had chosen to become legally dead rather than support him financially. "Mrs. Martinez, there's more," Detective Stevens continued. "Our investigation has located your husband. He's alive and currently residing in Phoenix, Arizona, under the identity of David Walsh. He's been living with a woman named Kimberly Walsh, presumably his girlfriend, and appears to be employed in the insurance industry." The irony of David working in insurance while committing insurance fraud wasn't lost on me, though I was too stunned to appreciate it fully in the moment. Phoenix, less than 400 miles from Riverside, close enough that he could probably see news about Tyler's school activities or my struggles with rent if he cared to look. Instead, he'd chosen to create an entirely new identity, while his son and I scraped by on my part-time salary and food stamps. The betrayal felt deeper than infidelity or even abandonment. This was systematic, calculated cruelty designed to ensure Tyler would grow up believing his father was dead, rather than simply unwilling to support him. "What happens now?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me felt like it was breaking apart and reassembling in a completely different configuration. "Do you arrest him? Does the insurance company pay the claim since he's actually alive? The criminal investigation is being handled by federal authorities since this involves interstate fraud. As for the insurance claim, that's become more complicated. Technically, David Martinez is legally dead according to state records. Even though we know he's alive, the legal process of reversing a death certificate is complex and time-consuming." Detective Stevens seemed genuinely sympathetic to my situation. "In the meantime, I'd strongly recommend consulting with an attorney about your options regarding child support enforcement and potential civil remedies." An attorney. Another expense I couldn't afford while working 28 hours a week at a grocery store and trying to keep Tyler in decent clothes and school supplies. But as I hung up the phone and stared at my reflection in the black television screen, something was changing inside me. The grief and confusion I'd carried for 6 months was crystallizing into something sharper and more focused. David thought he'd outsmarted everyone, disappearing into a comfortable new life while his responsibilities were buried, along with his fake death certificate. Tyler appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over his shoulder and that gap-toothed smile that made him look younger than his 8 years. "Ready for school, Mom?" he asked, and I realized that David's betrayal wasn't just about money or legal obligations. It was about this child who still asked about his daddy sometimes, who'd cried himself to sleep for weeks after the funeral, who'd grown quieter and more serious since losing the man he thought was his father. Quote, "Almost ready, sweetheart," I said, grabbing my keys and purse while my mind began forming the first tentative outlines of a plan. David Martinez might be legally dead, but Rachel Martinez was very much alive. And if he thought staging his own death would let him escape his responsibilities to Tyler, he was about to discover just how wrong he could be. The drive to Tyler's elementary school gave me 20 minutes to think through the implications of what I'd learned. David had meticulously planned his disappearance, arranging false identification, relocating to another state, and establishing a new relationship. The level of preparation suggested months of advance planning, which meant he'd been living a lie throughout our final months together. Every conversation about our future, every discussion about Tyler's needs, every moment of intimacy had been tainted by his secret knowledge that he intended to abandon us both. But his careful planning had also created opportunities I was only beginning to recognize. A legally dead man couldn't open bank accounts, couldn't establish credit, couldn't enter into contracts under his real name. David Walsh might be living comfortably in Phoenix, but David Martinez's legal obligations remained active and enforceable. Child support orders didn't disappear simply because the obligated parent decided to fake their death. After dropping Tyler off at school, I sat in my car in the parking lot and made a list of everyone I needed to contact. The Child Support Enforcement Office would need to know that the father they thought was deceased was actually living in Arizona. The Social Security Administration would need to be informed about the fraudulent death certificate. David's former employer would need to know that their deceased employee was actually working for a competitor in another state. Each phone call I planned to make represented another thread in the web of lies David had constructed. He'd thought his death would end all connections to his previous life, but instead, it had created a paper trail that led directly to his new identity. The David Martinez who owed thousands in back child support was legally the same person as David Walsh, who was apparently living well in Phoenix.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And Rachel Martinez was about to become very interested in ensuring that connection was clearly established for everyone who needed to know about it. The first call I made was to the Riverside County Child Support Enforcement Office. The caseworker who handled Tyler's file, Ms. Rodriguez, had been sympathetic but limited in her options when David died. Dead fathers couldn't pay child support, and estate recovery processes were complicated when there were no significant assets to claim. But a living father who'd committed fraud to avoid his obligations opened up entirely different possibilities. Mrs. Martinez, this is highly unusual, Ms. Rodriguez said after I explained the insurance company's findings. If your ex-husband is actually alive and working under a false identity, we have multiple avenues for enforcement, including interstate collection procedures and federal prosecution referrals. The energy in her voice suggested she'd encountered deadbeat parents before, but never one who'd gone to such elaborate lengths to avoid responsibility. Within an hour, Ms. Rodriguez had opened a new case file and initiated procedures to locate David's assets and employment in Arizona. The child support order remained valid and enforceable, with 6 months of accrued interest that would continue growing until payment was made. More importantly, the fraud added criminal penalties that could result in federal charges for identity theft, insurance fraud, and willful non-payment of child support across state lines. My second call was to the Social Security Administration Death Benefits Office. Tyler had been receiving survivor benefits since David's supposed death, payments that helped cover our basic expenses, but had never been enough to replace David's required support payments. Learning that these benefits had been paid based on fraudulent documentation meant the government would be very interested in recovering their money from David's new identity in Phoenix. The bureaucratic wheels that had slowly processed David's death certificate would now work just as methodically to unravel his deception. Every agency that had accepted his death as legitimate would need to reverse their records and pursue recovery of benefits paid in error. David Walsh's comfortable new life was about to be audited by multiple government agencies simultaneously, each with their own enforcement powers and collection procedures. But as satisfying as official channels might eventually prove to be, I realized they would take months or even years to produce results. Tyler needed support now, not after lengthy legal proceedings. And more than financial recovery, I needed David to understand that his betrayal had consequences he hadn't anticipated. The man who thought he could disappear without a trace was about to discover that his supposedly dead ex-wife was much more resourceful than he'd ever given her credit for. That afternoon, after picking Tyler up from school and helping him with homework, I began researching private investigation services in Phoenix. If David was living openly under the name David Walsh, working in insurance and dating Kimberly Walsh, then finding him shouldn't require extensive surveillance. But I needed photographic evidence, employment verification, and documentation of his lifestyle for the various agencies that would be pursuing collection and prosecution. The private investigator I eventually hired, Lisa Chen, specialized in locating individuals for child support enforcement cases. Her fee would strain my already tight budget, but she offered payment plans and guaranteed results within 2 weeks. More importantly, she understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about justice for a child whose father had chosen legal death over financial responsibility. Men who fake their deaths to avoid child support usually aren't very careful about maintaining their new identities, Lisa explained during our initial consultation. They think death creates permanent separation from their old lives, so they get comfortable and sloppy. If he's working in insurance under David Walsh, I'll find employment records, tax filings, and probably social media presence within a few days. Social media. In all my shock over David's deception, I hadn't thought to search for him online. David Martinez had never been active on social platforms, claiming they were a waste of time and invasion of privacy. But David Walsh might have different attitudes about sharing his new life with the world. The thought of discovering his activities through Instagram posts or Facebook check-ins felt both promising and deeply disturbing. That evening, after Tyler was asleep, I created fake social media accounts and began searching for David Walsh in Phoenix. The third platform I tried yielded immediate results. David Walsh, insurance agent at Phoenix Premier Coverage, in a relationship with Kimberly Walsh. His profile photo showed him grinning broadly next to a swimming pool, looking relaxed and well-fed in a way I hadn't seen during our final months together. The photos that followed told the story of a man living without financial stress or family obligations. Expensive dinners at upscale restaurants, weekend trips to Sedona and Flagstaff, golf outings at Desert Springs Country Club. David was spending money on entertainment and luxury items, while his son ate generic cereal and wore secondhand clothes. The contrast between his comfortable new lifestyle and Tyler's struggles made my anger crystallize into something much more focused and determined. Kimberly Walsh's profile was even more revealing. She regularly posted about their activities together, tagged their locations, and shared details about their living situation in Palm Valley apartments. More significantly, her post suggested she had no idea about David's previous life or the child he'd abandoned. Her captions referred to him as her soulmate and talked about their plans for the future as if David Walsh was his real identity rather than an elaborate lie designed to avoid responsibility. The woman sharing David's bed and benefiting from his fraudulently obtained freedom had no idea she was an accessory to child abandonment and insurance fraud. Whether Kimberly was an innocent victim of David's deception or a willing participant in his new identity remained to be determined, but her ignorance would make her a potential weak point in his carefully constructed facade. By midnight, I had screenshots of dozens of social media posts documenting David's activities over the past 6 months. Every expensive meal, every vacation, every luxury purchase was time-stamped and geotagged evidence that he was not only alive, but living well, while his court-ordered support payments went unpaid. The David Martinez who supposedly died to escape his responsibilities had been reborn as David Walsh, a man wealthy enough to afford country club memberships but too dishonest to support his own child. The transformation from grief-stricken widow to determined investigator had happened gradually over the course of a single day. But sitting in my small apartment with evidence of David's betrayal spread across my laptop screen, I felt like an entirely different person than the woman who'd opened that insurance letter 12 hours earlier. David had counted on my devastation, keeping me passive and unquestioning. Instead, his deception had revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. Tomorrow I would call Lisa Chen and provide her with the information I'd gathered. The private investigator would document David's new life officially, while I continued building the case that would ensure his comfortable existence in Phoenix became very uncomfortable very quickly. The man who'd thought death would free him from his obligations to Tyler was about to learn that some responsibilities transcended even fake graves and fraudulent identities. Tyler appeared in my doorway, rubbing his eyes and looking smaller than usual in his oversized pajamas. "Mom, I had a bad dream about Dad," he said quietly, and my heart broke all over again thinking about how David's selfish choices continued affecting our son even in his sleep. But as I tucked Tyler back into bed and kissed his forehead, I made him a silent promise that his father's abandonment wouldn't define his future. David Martinez might be legally dead, but Rachel Martinez had never been more alive or more determined to ensure that Tyler received everything his father owed him. The war David had started by faking his death was just beginning, and he had no idea how thoroughly he'd underestimated the woman he'd left behind to pick up the pieces of his betrayal. Lisa Chen's office occupied a modest suite in a professional building near downtown Riverside, the kind of place where people came to solve problems they couldn't handle alone. The waiting room smelled like coffee and determination, with certificates on the walls attesting to her expertise in locating missing persons and gathering evidence for family court cases. When she called my name, I followed her into an office that felt more like a command center than a traditional workspace, with multiple computer monitors and filing cabinets that suggested serious investigative capabilities. "Mrs. Martinez, I've reviewed the information you provided over the phone," Lisa said, settling behind her desk with a thick folder already prepared. "Your case is particularly interesting because most people who fake their deaths are trying to escape criminal charges or massive debt. Child support avoidance is more commonly handled through job hopping or hiding assets, not elaborate death staging." She opened the folder and spread out printed pages that showed she'd already begun preliminary research. The documents she showed me represented David's digital footprint in Phoenix. Employment records at Phoenix Premier Coverage showed David Walsh had been hired 4 months ago, shortly after his supposed death, with a salary that exceeded what he'd earned in Riverside. Bank account openings under his new identity occurred within weeks of his funeral. Credit card applications, apartment lease agreements, utility connections, all establishing David Walsh as a legitimate person with no connection to the legally dead David Martinez. "He's been thorough," Lisa admitted, flipping through pages of financial records. "Most people who attempt identity changes make mistakes in the first few months, but your ex-husband appears to have planned this extensively. However, thoroughness can work against him, because establishing a new identity requires creating extensive documentation, and documentation leaves trails." She pulled up David's social media profiles on her computer, the same ones I'd found the night before, but with additional analysis I hadn't thought to perform. Location data from his posts showed consistent patterns of activity around specific areas of Phoenix: restaurant check-ins, gym visits, shopping centers, all creating a map of his daily routines. More importantly, the timestamps on his posts could be cross-referenced with dates when he was supposed to be dead, providing irrefutable proof that David Martinez had been alive and active during the entire period of his supposed death. "The girlfriend is the weak link," Lisa continued, pulling up Kimberly's social media presence. "She's been documenting their relationship extensively, including details that suggest she believes David Walsh is his real name. Look at this post from 3 weeks ago." She pointed to a photo of Kimberly and David at a restaurant, with a caption that read, "Celebrating David's promotion at work. So proud of my amazing boyfriend, who worked so hard to build his career from nothing." From nothing. Kimberly genuinely believed David had started his insurance career in Phoenix without any previous experience or connections. She had no idea she was celebrating the professional success of a man who'd abandoned his child and committed multiple felonies to avoid financial responsibility. Her innocence would make her a valuable source of information if approached correctly, but it also meant she was another victim of David's elaborate deception. "What's your recommendation for documenting his current situation?" I asked, studying the evidence Lisa had compiled in just 24 hours. Her efficiency impressed me, but I also realized that David's carelessness on social media had made her job easier than it should have been for someone supposedly hiding from his past. "Direct surveillance for 2 weeks minimum," Lisa replied without hesitation. "I need photographs of him at work, at home, and engaged in activities that clearly show he's alive and well. Video documentation of his daily routines, employment verification from multiple sources, and evidence of his financial capacity to pay child support." She paused, considering additional options. "I'd also recommend attempting contact with the girlfriend to gauge her knowledge of his previous life, but that requires careful timing to avoid alerting David to the investigation." The cost for comprehensive surveillance would drain my savings account completely, but looking at the evidence of David's comfortable lifestyle while Tyler and I struggled with basic expenses, I felt the investment was justified. More than financial recovery, I needed documentation that would support criminal charges and ensure David faced consequences for the trauma he'd inflicted on his son through his fake death and abandonment. "There's something else you should know," Lisa said, her expression becoming more serious. "Identity theft and fraud cases involving child support avoidance carry federal penalties that include prison time. If we can prove David Martinez and David Walsh are the same person, and document his financial capacity to pay support, the case becomes criminal rather than just civil enforcement." She leaned forward, emphasizing the significance of this distinction. Criminal cases get priority attention from law enforcement and result in asset seizure to satisfy outstanding obligations. Asset seizure. The comfortable life David had built in Phoenix could be dismantled as systematically as he'd constructed it, with his possessions and accounts frozen to recover the child support he owed Tyler. The irony of using government enforcement powers against someone who'd tried to disappear from government oversight appealed to me on multiple levels, both practical and symbolic. We spent the next hour planning surveillance schedules and discussing the specific documentation needed for various agencies pursuing David's case. Child support enforcement required proof of employment and income capacity. Social Security needed evidence that benefits had been fraudulently obtained. The insurance company needed verification that their investigation had correctly identified David as alive and working under a false identity. Each agency had different evidentiary standards and procedural requirements, but all of them would benefit from comprehensive documentation of David's current life in Phoenix. Lisa's investigation would serve multiple purposes simultaneously, providing evidence for civil enforcement, criminal prosecution, and financial recovery. The man who thought he'd escaped all oversight by faking his death was about to discover that multiple government agencies were very interested in his activities. After leaving Lisa's office, I drove to Tyler's school to pick him up, my mind processing everything I'd learned about David's new life and the resources available to hold him accountable. The conversation with Lisa had transformed my anger into focused determination, giving me concrete steps to take and realistic expectations for results. For the first time since discovering David's deception, I felt like I had allies and advantages, rather than just problems and limitations. Tyler climbed into the passenger seat with his usual after-school energy, chattering about playground activities and upcoming school events, while I navigated traffic and mentally planned my next steps. His innocent enthusiasm reminded me that this battle wasn't just about my feelings of betrayal, but about ensuring Tyler received the financial support that would provide him with opportunities David's abandonment had threatened to eliminate. "Mom, can we get pizza tonight?" Tyler asked as we stopped at a red light. "Jenny's mom always gets pizza on Fridays, and she says it's because Friday is celebration day." I looked at my son in the rearview mirror, thinking about how David's child support payments would have made casual pizza dinners possible instead of the careful budgeting that made every restaurant meal a significant expense. "We'll see, sweetie," I said. The same response I gave to most of Tyler's requests for things other families took for granted. But privately, I was imagining a future where David's recovered support payments would allow Tyler to have pizza on Fridays without me calculating whether we could afford it. The evidence Lisa was gathering would make that future possible, transforming David's selfish escape from responsibility into resources for his son's well-being. That evening, after Tyler was asleep, I began researching David's new employer more thoroughly. Phoenix Premier Coverage had a professional website with employee profiles, and David Walsh was featured prominently in their insurance agent directory. His professional photo showed him in an expensive suit, smiling confidently in a way that suggested he felt completely secure in his new identity. The biography described him as a dedicated insurance professional with extensive experience in risk assessment and client relations, making no mention of his previous employment or the fact that David Walsh had only existed for 6 months. The company's success stories section included a testimonial from David about helping a family navigate a difficult claims situation, praising his commitment to client advocacy and ethical business practices. Reading about David's supposed ethical standards while knowing he'd abandoned his own child to avoid financial responsibility felt surreal. Like discovering that someone you knew was living an entirely fictional existence. I screenshot everything related to David's employment, adding it to the folder of evidence I was compiling for Lisa's investigation and the various agencies pursuing his case. Each piece of documentation strengthened the connection between David Martinez and David Walsh, making it harder for him to claim they were different people when authorities eventually confronted him about his fraudulent identity. Kimberly's social media provided even more detailed information about their living situation and daily activities. Her posts revealed they lived in a 2-bedroom apartment at Palm Valley Apartments, split household expenses evenly, and maintained separate bank accounts while sharing recreational costs. Most significantly, her financial transparency suggested she had no idea David was hiding from legal obligations that would affect their shared lifestyle if discovered. One post from the previous week showed Kimberly expressing gratitude for David's support during a difficult period at her job, praising his emotional maturity and commitment to their relationship. She described him as someone who'd overcome personal challenges to build a stable life, never knowing that his stability was built on abandoning his legal responsibilities to his child. Her genuine affection for David made her another victim of his deception, someone whose trust and emotional investment were being manipulated to provide cover for his fraud. The depth of David's lie became more apparent as I researched further into their relationship timeline. Kimberly's earliest posts mentioning David coincided almost exactly with his supposed death, suggesting he'd begun their relationship immediately after staging his disappearance. She'd fallen in love with someone who didn't exist, investing her emotions and sharing her life with a man whose entire identity was constructed to avoid accountability for his previous actions. By midnight, I had documented David's employment, living situation, relationship status, recreational activities, and financial capacity through publicly available information and social media research. The picture that emerged was of someone living comfortably within his means, capable of supporting himself and contributing to household expenses while maintaining an active social life. This evidence would be crucial for child support enforcement, proving that David had the financial ability to pay court-ordered support but was choosing to hide behind a false identity instead. The following Monday, Lisa began active surveillance of David's daily routines in Phoenix. She positioned herself outside Phoenix premiere coverage during business hours, documenting his arrival and departure times while photographing him in contexts that clearly showed his face and professional activities. The first day of surveillance confirmed his employment and provided visual evidence that David Walsh and David Martinez were physically the same person. Lisa's preliminary report, delivered by email that evening, included high-resolution photographs of David entering and leaving his workplace, interacting with colleagues, and driving the same model car he'd owned in Riverside. The visual documentation was supplemented by employment verification she'd obtained by posing as a potential client interested in working with David specifically. His supervisor had confirmed his full-time status, described his successful integration into the company culture, and mentioned his impressive sales figures for someone relatively new to the Phoenix market. The employment verification was particularly valuable because it established David's income level and job stability, two factors that would be crucial for calculating his child support obligation and demonstrating his ability to pay. Phoenix Premier Coverage was a successful firm with competitive salaries, and David's position as a senior agent suggested he was earning more than he had during our marriage, while claiming poverty to avoid supporting Tyler. Lisa's investigation expanded beyond workplace surveillance to document David's living situation and recreational activities. She photographed him at Palm Valley Apartments, confirmed his residency through apartment management contacts, and documented his frequent visits to Desert Springs Country Club for golf outings that cost more per round than I spent on Tyler's weekly groceries. Each expensive activity David enjoyed was evidence that his claims of financial hardship were fabricated to justify abandoning his son. The country club membership was particularly revealing because it required significant upfront fees and monthly dues that demonstrated discretionary spending capacity well beyond basic living expenses. David was choosing to spend money on luxury recreational activities while his court-ordered child support remained unpaid, a prioritization that would be legally significant when authorities calculated his ability to pay and determined appropriate enforcement measures. By the end of the first week of surveillance, Lisa had documented David's comfortable lifestyle comprehensively enough to support criminal charges for willful non-payment of child support. But she recommended continuing surveillance for another week, to gather additional evidence and attempt contact with Kimberly to assess her knowledge of David's previous life and current legal situation. Approaching the girlfriend is risky, Lisa explained during our midweek check-in call. If she's genuinely unaware of David's true identity, contact could alert her to investigate his background more thoroughly. But if she knows about his previous life and is helping him hide, we need to document that complicity for potential conspiracy charges. The decision about contacting Kimberly would depend on additional information gathered during continued surveillance. That same week, the various agencies I'd contacted began their own investigations into David's fraudulent activities. The Child Support Enforcement Office initiated interstate collection procedures, formally requesting information from Arizona authorities about David Walsh's employment and assets. Social Security began auditing survivor benefit payments made to Tyler since David's supposed death, calculating the total amount that would need to be recovered from David's current income. Most significantly, the federal investigation into identity theft and insurance fraud had been elevated to active case status, with investigators assigned to coordinate between California and Arizona jurisdictions. David's elaborate scheme to avoid child support had attracted attention from multiple law enforcement agencies, each with their own enforcement powers and criminal penalties. The man who thought faking his death would end his legal troubles had actually created far more serious criminal exposure than simple child support avoidance. The insurance company investigation had also progressed beyond the initial fraud determination. Henderson Life Insurance was pursuing criminal charges for the fraudulent death certificate and seeking recovery of investigation costs from David's current assets. They'd also referred the case to other insurance companies David had worked with during his career, resulting in industry-wide scrutiny of his professional activities and potential pattern of fraudulent behavior. By Friday of that week, David Walsh's comfortable life in Phoenix was under investigation by 6 different agencies, none of which he was aware of yet. The surveillance Lisa was conducting would provide evidence for all of these investigations, creating a comprehensive case that would be difficult for David to defend or escape through additional identity changes. The transformation from grieving widow to determined prosecutor of David's fraud had happened gradually over the course of 2 weeks. But sitting in my apartment on Friday evening with updates from multiple agencies and daily surveillance reports, I realized I'd developed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. The woman David had dismissed as passive and dependent was coordinating a multi-agency investigation that would systematically dismantle the new life he'd built on lies. Tyler was playing video games in the living room, unaware that his father's abandonment was being challenged through legal channels that would ultimately provide him with the financial support he deserved. The innocence of his Friday evening entertainment contrasted sharply with the serious business of holding David accountable for his choices, but both were part of ensuring Tyler's future wasn't defined by his father's betrayal. The weekend brought Lisa's most significant breakthrough in the investigation. Saturday evening surveillance at Desert Springs Country Club had captured David and Kimberly at a social event celebrating his recent promotion at Phoenix Premier Coverage. The photographs showed them relaxed and celebratory, with David wearing expensive clothing and displaying confident body language that suggested he felt completely secure in his new identity. More importantly, Lisa had overheard conversations that revealed David's future plans with Kimberly, including discussions about purchasing a house together and potentially expanding their family. The man who'd abandoned one child to avoid financial responsibility was planning to create new family obligations while his existing son struggled without support. This evidence would be particularly powerful for demonstrating his willful avoidance of existing responsibilities while pursuing new ones. The house purchase discussion was legally significant because it would require David to apply for a mortgage under his false identity, creating additional documentation of his fraud while establishing assets that could be seized to satisfy his child support debt. Lisa recommended alerting authorities to monitor David's mortgage applications, ensuring that any real estate purchases could be immediately subject to liens and seizure orders. Sunday's surveillance focused on David and Kimberly's domestic routines, documenting their shared household activities and lifestyle patterns. The photographs showed them grocery shopping together, sharing household tasks, and displaying the comfortable domesticity of an established couple. For Kimberly, this was probably a normal weekend with her boyfriend. For David, it was evidence that he'd successfully replaced his abandoned family with a new relationship built on lies. The domestic surveillance also revealed details about their financial arrangements that would be valuable for asset recovery efforts. They appeared to split expenses equally, suggesting David had sufficient disposable income to contribute significantly to household costs, while his court-ordered child support remained unpaid. This evidence would contradict any future claims that he lacked the financial capacity to support Tyler. By Sunday evening, Lisa had compiled 2 weeks of comprehensive surveillance documentation that proved David Martinez and David Walsh were the same person, established his employment and income level, demonstrated his discretionary spending capacity, and revealed his plans for major purchases that would create additional attachable assets. The investigation had provided everything needed to support criminal charges and civil enforcement actions across multiple jurisdictions. The evidence package Lisa prepared for Monday delivery to various agencies represented the systematic dismantling of David's carefully constructed new identity. Every photograph, every document, every piece of surveillance data contributed to a case that would be impossible for David to deny or escape. The man who thought he'd disappeared completely had actually created an extensive record of his fraudulent activities and comfortable lifestyle. More satisfying than the legal implications was the personal vindication of proving that David's abandonment hadn't destroyed my ability to protect Tyler's interests. The investigation had revealed capabilities and resources I'd never known were available, transforming me from a victim of David's deception into an active agent of accountability. Tyler's father might have chosen to become legally dead rather than support him, but his mother had chosen to become more determined and resourceful than David had ever imagined possible. The coordinated assault on David's fraudulent new life began on a Tuesday morning, when Lisa's final surveillance report landed in the hands of 6 different agencies simultaneously. Agent Maria Santos, from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division, was the first to act, initiating a formal investigation into interstate identity theft and fraud. By noon, David Walsh's employment records at Phoenix Premier Coverage were under federal subpoena, and his banking activities were being monitored for suspicious transactions that might indicate additional fraudulent behavior. The speed at which federal authorities moved surprised even Lisa, who'd handled dozens of similar cases but never seen one escalate to FBI involvement so quickly. Agent Santos explained during our phone consultation that David's case represented multiple federal crimes committed across state lines, making it a priority for interstate crime enforcement. The systematic nature of his identity theft, combined with the elaborate staging of his own death, elevated the case beyond simple child support avoidance into sophisticated fraud that warranted serious federal attention. Mrs. Martinez, your ex-husband's activities represent a pattern of behavior that suggests this isn't his first attempt at identity manipulation, Agent Santos explained during our phone conference. We're investigating whether David Martinez has used similar tactics before, possibly in other states or under different circumstances. The level of planning and execution in his current fraud suggests experience with identity theft and document forgery that goes beyond amateur attempts to avoid child support. The possibility that David's deception extended beyond our immediate situation added new dimensions to the investigation and new potential for recovery of assets he might have hidden in previous schemes. If David had been systematically avoiding obligations through identity theft for years, the total amount of recoverable assets could be substantial enough to provide Tyler with long-term financial security rather than just current support payments. While federal investigators pursued David's criminal activities, the Child Support Enforcement Office initiated immediate asset seizure procedures against David Walsh's employment and banking accounts. The process moved with bureaucratic efficiency that impressed me, considering how slowly the same agencies had responded to routine inquiries during our marriage. Within 48 hours of receiving Lisa's evidence package, enforcement officers had frozen David's primary bank account and initiated garnishment procedures against his salary at Phoenix Premier Coverage. The garnishment order was particularly satisfying because it would be processed through David's employer, alerting his colleagues and supervisors to his legal troubles, while simultaneously recovering funds for Tyler's support. David's comfortable professional image would be damaged by the revelation that he was subject to wage garnishment for child support, potentially affecting his career advancement and peer relationships at Phoenix Premier Coverage. But the most immediate impact came from the Social Security Administration's recovery procedures for fraudulently obtained survivor benefits. The agency calculated that Tyler had received approximately $18,000 in benefits based on David's fake death certificate, and they initiated immediate collection procedures to recover this amount from David Walsh's assets. The recovery included interest and penalties that brought the total obligation to nearly $25,000, a sum that would significantly impact David's financial stability in Phoenix. The Social Security recovery was processed as a priority debt that took precedence over most other financial obligations, meaning David's wages and assets would be garnished for government recovery before he could access funds for living expenses or recreational activities. His comfortable lifestyle at Desert Springs Country Club and expensive dinner dates with Kimberly would become impossible once federal agencies began systematic collection of his fraudulently obtained benefits. Lisa's continued surveillance during the week following agency notification provided fascinating documentation of David's growing awareness that his new identity was under investigation. Wednesday morning surveillance showed him arriving at work normally, but leaving early with visible agitation after what appeared to be a difficult conversation with his supervisor. By Thursday, his routine had changed completely, with multiple phone calls made from his car during lunch breaks and nervous behavior that suggested he was beginning to suspect his fraud had been discovered. The change in David's behavior was most apparent in his evening activities with Kimberly. Their usual restaurant visits were replaced by quiet evenings at home, and their weekend plans for golf and social events were canceled without explanation. Lisa's photographs showed increasingly tense conversations between them, with body language suggesting David was struggling to maintain his calm facade while dealing with mounting legal pressure. Kimberly's social media posts reflected the growing tension in their relationship, though she clearly didn't understand its source. Her weekend post showed concern about David's recent stress and work pressures, expressing support for his difficult period, while encouraging him to consider therapy or counseling for what she perceived as job-related anxiety. Her genuine care for David's emotional well-being made her another victim of his deception, someone whose trust and affection were being exploited to provide cover for his increasingly desperate situation. The first direct contact between authorities and David occurred Friday afternoon when Agent Santos and a Phoenix police detective visited him at Phoenix Premier Coverage for an initial interview. Lisa's surveillance captured David being escorted to a conference room by federal agents, his face displaying the shock of someone who'd believed himself completely hidden from his past. The interview lasted 90 minutes, after which David left work immediately and drove directly home to Kimberly's apartment. The federal interview was followed by a weekend of intensive phone calls and internet searches that Lisa documented through her surveillance of David's activities. His behavior suggested someone researching legal representation and trying to understand the scope of the charges he was facing. More tellingly, his searches appeared to focus on federal penalties for identity theft and fraud, indicating he was beginning to comprehend the serious criminal exposure his child support avoidance had created. By Monday of the following week, the impact on David's professional life became apparent when Phoenix Premier Coverage placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigation. His supervisor, who'd previously praised his ethical standards and professional commitment, was now required to cooperate with federal authorities investigating his employee for multiple felonies. The career David had built in Phoenix was crumbling as systematically as he'd constructed it. The administrative leave eliminated David's primary source of income, just as federal agencies began garnishing his wages and freezing his assets. His comfortable financial situation in Phoenix transformed overnight into a cash flow crisis that would make it impossible to maintain his previous lifestyle or continue hiding behind the David Walsh identity. The man who'd thought he could escape his obligations by faking his death was discovering that legal responsibilities could pursue him across state lines and false identities. Kimberly's reaction to David's employment crisis provided additional insight into the depth of his deception. Her social media posts expressed confusion and concern about his sudden job loss, describing it as unfair treatment by an employer who'd previously valued his contributions. She had no idea that David's administrative leave was the result of federal criminal investigation, not workplace politics or performance issues. Her continued ignorance of his true situation demonstrated how completely David had isolated her from his past and current legal troubles. The employment crisis forced David to confront decisions about his relationship with Kimberly that would inevitably expose his fraudulent identity. He could maintain his lies and watch their shared life deteriorate under financial pressure, or reveal his true situation and risk losing her support entirely. Either choice would eliminate the stability and emotional cover that Kimberly's relationship had provided for his new identity. Lisa's surveillance captured David's decision-making process through documentation of increasingly desperate behavior as his situation deteriorated. His phone calls became more frequent and agitated, suggesting unsuccessful attempts to find legal representation or alternative sources of income. His internet searches expanded from federal penalties to bankruptcy procedures and asset protection strategies, indicating he was considering additional fraudulent activities to preserve his remaining resources. Most significantly, David's surveillance of his own neighborhood increased dramatically as he became aware that his activities were being monitored. Lisa documented him checking for surveillance vehicles, varying his routes to work and home, and displaying the paranoid behavior of someone who knew he was under investigation but didn't understand the full scope of the agencies pursuing him. His amateur counter-surveillance efforts provided additional evidence of consciousness of guilt that would be valuable for criminal prosecution. The psychological pressure of living under federal investigation while maintaining his fraudulent identity began affecting David's relationship with Kimberly in ways that Lisa's surveillance captured clearly. Their conversations became more strained, their physical affection decreased, and their shared activities virtually disappeared as David became increasingly focused on his legal troubles. The romantic relationship that had provided motivation for his elaborate fraud was deteriorating under the weight of his deception. Wednesday of the second week brought David's first direct contact with child support enforcement authorities, when Arizona officers served him with formal documentation of the interstate collection case. The service occurred at Palm Valley Apartments, providing Kimberly with her first exposure to David's legal troubles and child support obligations. Lisa's surveillance captured her shock and confusion as she witnessed federal agents serving David with legal papers related to his abandoned son in California. The child support service represented a turning point in David's ability to maintain his deception with Kimberly. She could no longer be protected from the knowledge that her boyfriend had legal obligations to a child he'd abandoned, though she still didn't understand the full scope of his fraudulent death and identity theft. Her social media posts ceased entirely after the service, suggesting she was processing information that challenged everything she'd believed about David's character and past. The formal service also triggered additional legal procedures that would accelerate the collection process. David's remaining assets in Arizona became subject to immediate seizure. His credit accounts were frozen pending investigation, and his ability to travel was restricted through federal monitoring procedures. The comfortable life he'd built in Phoenix was being dismantled systematically by the same government agencies he'd thought he'd escaped through his fake death. By Thursday, David's financial situation had become desperate enough to force additional deceptive behavior that created new criminal exposure. Bank records obtained through federal subpoena showed him attempting to transfer funds to accounts under different names, suggesting he was either creating new false identities or involving others in his fraud. These new transactions provided evidence of ongoing criminal activity that would strengthen federal charges and potentially implicate additional conspirators. The fund transfer attempts also demonstrated David's continued commitment to avoiding his child support obligations rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. Instead of using his remaining resources to begin paying Tyler's support, he was attempting to hide assets through additional fraudulent means. This behavior would be particularly damaging during criminal sentencing, showing a pattern of escalating deception rather than acceptance of responsibility. Lisa's final surveillance report documented David's complete transformation from confident insurance agent to desperate fugitive, aware that his elaborate fraud was collapsing around him. His professional appearance deteriorated. His social activities ceased entirely, and his relationship with Kimberly appeared to be ending as she processed the revelation of his hidden child and legal troubles. The man who'd thought he could start fresh by faking his death was discovering that his past couldn't be escaped through lies and new identities. The most satisfying aspect of watching David's situation deteriorate was knowing that every action I'd taken was legal and justified, while his attempts to avoid consequences required additional crimes that would only worsen his eventual punishment. He'd chosen to create this crisis through his selfish decision to abandon Tyler, and now he was experiencing the systematic dismantling of the life he'd built on that abandonment. Friday brought the news I'd been anticipating since beginning this process. Agent Santos called to inform me that David had been arrested on federal charges of identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, and willful non-payment of child support across state lines. The arrest occurred at Palm Valley Apartments during an early morning raid that also resulted in seizure of his remaining personal assets and electronic devices that would provide evidence of his fraudulent activities. The arrest was particularly meaningful because it occurred in front of Kimberly, who finally learned the full scope of David's deception, as federal agents explained the charges against him. Lisa's final surveillance photographs showed Kimberly's devastation as she realized the man she'd fallen in love with had not only abandoned his child, but had built their entire relationship on lies designed to hide his criminal activities. She'd been manipulated as completely as I had been, though her trauma was financial and emotional, rather than the systematic abandonment Tyler and I had experienced. David's arrest marked the end of his comfortable life in Phoenix and the beginning of federal prosecution that would ensure he faced serious consequences for his elaborate fraud. The charges carried potential sentences that would keep him in prison for years, during which time his child support obligations would continue accruing with interest and penalties. His attempt to escape his responsibilities to Tyler had transformed a civil debt into federal crimes with far more serious consequences than simple wage garnishment would have imposed. More importantly, the federal charges would result in asset forfeiture procedures that would recover not only the child support David owed, but also penalties and restitution that would provide Tyler with substantial financial resources for his future. The comfortable lifestyle David had enjoyed in Phoenix would be liquidated to satisfy his legal obligations, ensuring that his attempt to avoid supporting his son would actually result in greater financial recovery than consistent payment would have provided. The transformation of David's elaborate escape plan into comprehensive legal accountability represented more than just personal vindication. It demonstrated that parental responsibilities couldn't be avoided through fraud and deception, and that abandoned children had legal protections that would pursue deadbeat parents across state lines and false identities. Tyler's father had tried to disappear rather than support him, but the legal system had mechanisms to ensure that children's needs took priority over parents' selfish desires to escape their obligations. Standing in my kitchen the morning after David's arrest, reading Agent Santos's emails summarizing the charges and potential recovery amounts, I felt the completion of a journey that had begun with insurance fraud discovery and evolved into comprehensive justice for Tyler's abandonment. The woman who'd been devastated by her husband's fake death had become someone capable of coordinating multi-agency investigations and ensuring accountability across multiple jurisdictions. Tyler was eating breakfast at the same table where I'd first learned about David's deception, unaware that his father's arrest meant financial security and justice for the abandonment he'd suffered. The innocence of his morning routine contrasted with the complexity of the legal machinery that had been activated to protect his interests. But both represented the same fundamental truth that children deserve support from their parents, regardless of the parents' willingness to provide it. David's arrest was just the beginning of legal processes that would continue for months, but the immediate crisis of Tyler's financial insecurity had been resolved through systematic application of legal remedies David had thought he could avoid. The man who'd tried to become invisible had instead become the focus of federal prosecution, asset forfeiture, and interstate enforcement that would follow him, regardless of what identity he attempted to use next. The victory wasn't just financial or legal, though both were significant. It was the personal satisfaction of proving that David's assessment of my capabilities had been as wrong as his belief that he could escape his responsibilities through elaborate deception. The passive, dependent wife he'd abandoned had become someone formidable enough to coordinate his comprehensive downfall, while maintaining her moral and legal integrity throughout the process. Most importantly, Tyler would grow up knowing that his mother had fought for his rights and ensured his father faced consequences for abandoning him. The trauma of believing his father had died would eventually heal, but the knowledge that his mother had pursued justice when he couldn't protect himself would provide lifelong security about her commitment to his well-being and future. David's comfortable life in Phoenix had ended with federal agents at his door, while Tyler's future had been secured through the systematic pursuit of legal accountability. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd been completely rebuilt with justice and responsibility as their foundation, rather than lies and abandonment. The phone call came at 11:37 on a Tuesday night, 3 days after David's arrest. I'd been reviewing Tyler's homework and preparing for another day of coordinating with federal agencies when my cell phone displayed a number I didn't recognize with a Phoenix area code. Something about the timing and the unfamiliar digits made my pulse quicken before I even considered answering. After 5 rings, curiosity overcame caution. "Rachel, please don't hang up." David's voice hit me like a physical shock, carrying a desperation I'd never heard during our entire marriage. He sounded older, strained, with the hollow echo that suggested he was calling from a detention facility. "I need to talk to you about Tyler, and about what's happening with all these charges." The audacity of him using Tyler's name after abandoning our son to avoid financial responsibility made my jaw clench. "Who is this?" I asked, though we both knew the pretense was pointless. His legal death had been thoroughly disproven by federal investigators, but hearing his actual voice felt surreal after months of watching him through surveillance cameras. "It's me. And I know you know it's me. Look, there are things about this situation that you don't understand, and we need to work something out before this gets completely out of hand." David's voice carried the calculated tone of someone trying to negotiate from a position of weakness while pretending to have leverage. "These federal charges are serious, and they're not just affecting me. They're going to impact Tyler too if this drags out." The manipulation was immediate and predictable. David had spent 8 months living comfortably in Phoenix while his son received government assistance based on his fake death, but now he was claiming concern about Tyler's well-being. "How exactly would federal prosecution of your fraud impact Tyler?" I asked, settling into my kitchen chair with the grim satisfaction of someone about to hear their opponent's desperate justifications. "Rachel, you have to understand that I never meant for things to go this far. The whole death thing was supposed to be temporary, just until I could get my finances straightened out and figure out a way to pay the support without destroying my ability to earn a living." His explanation sounded rehearsed, like something he'd practiced with a public defender who'd told him to accept responsibility while minimizing his culpability. Temporary. He'd maintained his fraudulent death for 8 months, established a new career, built a romantic relationship, and made plans to purchase a house with his girlfriend. Every aspect of his behavior demonstrated permanent commitment to his false identity, not temporary financial difficulty. Quote, "David, you established credit under a false name, got a job using fraudulent documentation, and filed tax returns as a dead person. Nothing about your situation was temporary." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up, but eventually his voice returned smaller and more defensive. "Look, the whole David Walsh thing got more complicated than I planned, but that doesn't change the fact that this federal case is going to hurt Tyler more than it helps him. If I go to prison for years, he won't get any support at all." That was when I realized David still didn't understand the full scope of what was happening to him, or why. He thought the federal charges were simply punishment for child support avoidance, not recognition that a systematic fraud had created far more serious criminal liability. "David, you're not just facing child support enforcement. You committed identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, and insurance fraud across state lines. The child support was just what started the investigation." "But that's exactly my point," he said with growing desperation. "All of this started because you couldn't just accept that I was dead and move on with your life. If you'd left things alone, Tyler would have gotten survivor benefits, and you could have rebuilt without dragging me through federal court." The breathtaking selfishness of his perspective momentarily left me speechless. He genuinely believed that discovering his fraud and pursuing accountability was somehow unfair to him, that I should have been grateful for government assistance based on his lies, rather than ensuring Tyler received support from his living father. So your plan was for Tyler to grow up believing his father died rather than abandoned him, while you lived comfortably in Phoenix with your new girlfriend. Kimberly doesn't have anything to do with this, David said quickly, and I could hear the protective concern in his voice that he'd never shown for Tyler's well-being. She didn't know about any of the legal stuff, and now she's being questioned by federal agents like she was part of some conspiracy. You've destroyed an innocent person's life just to get back at me. His concern for Kimberly's emotional trauma while dismissing Tyler's abandonment revealed exactly where his priorities remained. Even facing federal prosecution, David was more worried about his girlfriend's discomfort than his son's needs. Kimberly fell in love with someone who doesn't exist. That's not my fault, it's yours. Rachel, listen to me carefully, David said, his tone shifting to something harder and more calculated. I know you think you've won something here, but you need to understand what's really going to happen. If I get convicted on federal charges, I'll be in prison for years. No child support payments, no asset recovery, nothing for Tyler, except the knowledge that his mother destroyed his father's life out of spite. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. David was suggesting that pursuing accountability for his fraud would ultimately hurt Tyler more than accepting his abandonment. It was the same manipulative logic he'd used throughout our marriage, framing his selfish choices as somehow protective of others, while positioning any consequences as unfair punishment. Here's what you don't seem to understand, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when everything inside me was burning with 8 months of accumulated anger. The federal government has seized all your assets in Arizona. Your car, your bank accounts, your personal property, everything you bought with money you should have been sending to Tyler. All of that gets liquidated to pay restitution. I could hear his breathing change as the financial implications registered. He'd been focused on avoiding prison time without considering that his comfortable Phoenix lifestyle was being dismantled systematically to satisfy his legal obligations. The child support you owe has been accumulating interest and penalties for 8 months. The Social Security benefits Tyler received based on your fake death have to be repaid with additional fines. Your former employer in Riverside is being audited for any insurance fraud involving your fake death. I was listing the consequences methodically, ensuring he understood the scope of what his deception had triggered. Most importantly, I continued, Tyler is going to receive more financial support through asset forfeiture and restitution than he ever would have gotten from your regular payments. Your attempt to avoid supporting him has actually resulted in a much larger financial recovery for his future. The silence that followed was profound. I could picture David's face processing the reality that his elaborate escape plan had not only failed, but had actually worsened his situation dramatically. Instead of negotiating reduced child support payments through legitimate legal channels, he'd created federal criminal exposure that would result in complete asset forfeiture. This is insane, he finally said, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone who'd expected a different outcome. All I wanted was to start over without being destroyed financially by support payments I couldn't afford. Now you're telling me the government is taking everything I worked for in Phoenix? Everything you worked for was stolen identities using fraudulent documentation while abandoning your legal responsibilities. I corrected. The comfortable life you built in Phoenix was paid for with money that should have been supporting Tyler. But what about Tyler's relationship with me? David asked, shifting tactics again. If I'm in federal prison, he loses his father completely. Is that really what you want for him? The question revealed how completely David misunderstood both his relationship with Tyler and the impact of his choices. David, Tyler already lost his father. You made sure of that when you chose to fake your death rather than support him. He spent months grieving for someone who was actually playing golf in Phoenix. That's not fair, David protested. I was trying to figure out a way to manage everything without hurting anyone. You hurt everyone, I said, my voice finally reflecting the anger I'd been suppressing. Tyler cried himself to sleep for weeks thinking his daddy was dead. I struggled to pay rent and buy groceries while you were living in a nice apartment and joining country clubs. Kimberly built a relationship with someone who doesn't exist. Your deception hurt every person who cared about you. So what happens now? He asked after another long silence. You've destroyed my life, you've hurt Kimberly, and Tyler still doesn't have his father. What exactly did you accomplish with all this? The question demonstrated that even facing federal charges, David still saw himself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. He genuinely couldn't understand why systematic fraud and child abandonment had resulted in serious consequences, or why other people weren't sympathetic to his desire to escape his responsibilities. What I accomplished, I said carefully, was ensuring that Tyler will be financially secure despite his father's decision to abandon him. What I accomplished was proving that parents can't escape their legal obligations to their children through lies and fraud. What I accomplished was making sure you face actual consequences for choosing to disappear rather than support your son. But I'm willing to pay support now, David said desperately. If you'll talk to the federal prosecutors about reducing the charges, I'll agree to whatever payment plan they want. Tyler can start getting regular support immediately. The offer came 8 months too late, and only under duress from federal prosecution. David wasn't volunteering to support Tyler out of parental responsibility. He was negotiating to reduce his criminal exposure. David, you had 8 months to voluntarily pay child support. Instead, you spent that time building a new life funded by the money you should have been sending to Tyler. I made mistakes, he admitted, but destroying my entire future doesn't help Tyler. If you really care about our son's well-being, you should want me to be able to support him long-term instead of sitting in federal prison. The manipulative framing was exactly what I'd expected. David was positioning his accountability as somehow harmful to Tyler, suggesting that allowing him to escape consequences would benefit our son more than ensuring he faced justice for his abandonment. Tyler's future is already secured through asset forfeiture and restitution, I reminded him. He'll receive more financial support from the liquidation of your Phoenix assets than he would have gotten from years of regular payments. And he'll grow up knowing that his father faced consequences for abandoning him instead of learning that fraud and deception are acceptable ways to avoid responsibility. You're going to tell him about all this? David asked, sounding genuinely shocked that Tyler might learn the truth about his father's character and choices. Tyler deserves to know the truth about why his father disappeared from his life. He deserves to understand that the grief he experienced over your death was manufactured by someone who chose abandonment over accountability. The decision to eventually tell Tyler the complete truth about David's fraud had been difficult, but he had a right to understand his father's actual character rather than maintaining illusions based on lies. Rachel, please, David said, his voice breaking slightly. I know I made terrible choices, and I know I hurt Tyler and you and Kimberly, but sending me to federal prison for years doesn't fix any of that damage. It just creates more trauma for everyone involved. His plea might have been more convincing if he'd shown similar concern for trauma when he was planning his fake death and abandoning Tyler. The trauma was created when you chose to fake your death, rather than support your son. The federal charges are just consequences for the crimes you committed to avoid your parental responsibilities. What if I agree to pay everything I owe plus additional support for Tyler's future? David asked, trying a different approach. What if I liquidate everything in Phoenix voluntarily and set up a trust fund that gives Tyler more than the court-ordered support? The offer demonstrated that David had financial resources he'd been hiding throughout the entire process. Money that could have been used to support Tyler if he'd chosen parental responsibility over personal comfort. David, the federal investigation has already identified all your assets in Arizona. They're being seized regardless of whether you cooperate or resist. But if I cooperate fully and accept responsibility, maybe the prosecutors will consider a reduced sentence that lets me maintain some ability to support Tyler going forward. He pressed. Destroying my life completely doesn't benefit anyone. His continued focus on his own interests while framing cooperation as somehow beneficial to Tyler revealed that fundamental aspects of his character hadn't changed despite facing federal prosecution. He was still calculating ways to minimize consequences for his choices, rather than genuinely accepting responsibility for the harm he'd caused. David, you're calling from a detention facility because you committed multiple federal crimes to avoid supporting your son, I said firmly. The consequences you're facing are the direct result of your choices, not unfair punishment imposed by vindictive prosecutors. "I understand that," he said quietly. "And I know I can't undo the damage I've caused or take back the pain I've put everyone through. But I'm asking you to think about Tyler's future and whether destroying me completely is really what's best for him." The conversation had come full circle to David's central argument that somehow his accountability would harm Tyler more than his abandonment had. Even facing federal prosecution, he couldn't accept that parents who abandon their children should face serious consequences regardless of how those consequences affected their future ability to provide support. "Tyler's future was secured the moment federal agents arrested you and began seizing your assets," I said. "Everything else is just making sure you face appropriate consequences for choosing to abandon your son, rather than support him." The silence that followed was different from his previous pauses. This one carried the weight of someone finally beginning to understand that their attempts at manipulation and negotiation weren't going to reduce the consequences they were facing. "Rachel," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know you have every right to hate me for what I've done, but Tyler is still my son, and I love him even though I made terrible choices about how to handle my responsibilities to him." The claim to love Tyler, while having abandoned him to avoid financial support, felt hollow. But it also represented the first time David had acknowledged any emotional connection to our son rather than just discussing him as a financial obligation. "If you love Tyler," I said carefully, "then you'll accept responsibility for what you've done and stop trying to minimize the consequences of your choices. He deserves to see that actions have consequences, and that people who harm others are held accountable for their behavior." "Does he know about the arrest?" David asked quietly. "He knows his father is alive and that legal proceedings are ensuring he receives the support he's entitled to," I said. "The details will come when he's old enough to understand them fully." The call ended shortly after that, with David accepting that his situation wasn't negotiable and that the federal prosecution would proceed regardless of his preferences or concerns about fairness. The man who tried to escape accountability through elaborate fraud had finally encountered consequences that couldn't be avoided through additional lies or manipulation. Hanging up the phone, I felt the completion of something that had begun 8 months earlier with the discovery of David's fake death. The conversation had confirmed that David still prioritized his own interests over Tyler's well-being, still saw himself as the victim of unfair treatment rather than the architect of his own destruction. But it had also demonstrated that his ability to manipulate situations and avoid consequences had been permanently ended by federal prosecution and asset seizure. Tyler was sleeping peacefully in his room, unaware that his father had called to negotiate consequences for abandoning him. The innocence of his rest contrasted with the complexity of ensuring accountability for parental abandonment. But both represented the same fundamental truth that children deserved protection from the selfish choices of adults who prioritized their own comfort over their responsibilities. David's call had been his final attempt to control the narrative and minimize his accountability, but it had only reinforced my conviction that the systematic pursuit of justice had been necessary and appropriate. The man who'd thought he could disappear without consequences had learned that some responsibilities couldn't be escaped through any amount of deception or manipulation. The federal courthouse in downtown Riverside felt different from the family court where David and I had finalized our divorce 2 years earlier. The marble floors and high ceilings suggested permanence and gravity that matched the significance of David's criminal sentencing hearing. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, watching federal marshals escort David to the defendant's chair in orange jail clothing that contrasted sharply with the expensive suits he'd worn during our marriage and his comfortable months in Phoenix. Tyler was at school, unaware that his father was being sentenced for the elaborate fraud he'd committed to avoid supporting him. The decision to keep Tyler away from the proceedings had been difficult, but Agent Santos had advised that courtroom testimony might include details about David's deception that would be traumatic for an 8-year-old to hear. Tyler would learn the complete truth eventually, but today was about legal accountability rather than family healing. David looked older and thinner than he had in Lisa's surveillance photographs from Phoenix. 3 months in federal detention had stripped away the confident appearance he'd cultivated as David Walsh, revealing someone who'd finally grasped the serious consequences of his systematic fraud. His public defender, a young woman named Jennifer Hayes, sat beside him reviewing notes that seemed inadequate for the complexity of his case. The courtroom filled gradually with representatives from the various agencies David's fraud had impacted. Agent Santos sat with the FBI prosecution team. Ms. Rodriguez, from Child Support Enforcement, had brought files documenting Tyler's financial needs and David's payment history. Social Security Administration investigators carried documentation of the fraudulent benefits they'd paid based on David's fake death certificate. Even representatives from Henderson Life Insurance were present to witness the sentencing of someone whose deception had cost them investigation resources and settlement funds. Judge Patricia Chen called the court to order with the business-like efficiency of someone who'd handled hundreds of federal criminal cases. Her expression as she reviewed David's file suggested she found his crimes particularly egregious, not because of their sophistication, but because of their impact on an innocent child. Federal judges saw elaborate financial frauds regularly, but cases involving child abandonment added emotional weight that influenced sentencing decisions. Mr. Martinez. Judge Chen began, looking directly at David with an expression that offered no sympathy for his situation. You have pleaded guilty to identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, and willful non-payment of child support across state lines. These charges carry significant penalties, but before imposing sentence, I want to ensure you understand the full scope of your actions and their consequences. David stood at his attorney's prompting, his posture suggesting someone who'd been coached about courtroom decorum, but remained uncomfortable with the formal proceedings. Yes, Your Honor, I understand the charges and accept responsibility for my actions, he said in a voice that carried none of the confidence he'd displayed during our phone conversation from detention. Mr. Martinez, your criminal activities weren't impulsive mistakes or momentary lapses in judgment, Judge Chen continued. You systematically planned and executed an elaborate fraud that involved staging your own death, creating false identification documents, establishing fraudulent employment records, and maintaining deceptive relationships for 8 months. This represents sophisticated criminal behavior with far-reaching consequences for multiple victims. The judge's summary of David's crimes made them sound even more calculated and comprehensive than I'd realized during my own investigation. Each element of his fraud had required advanced planning and continued deception, demonstrating a commitment to avoiding his parental responsibilities that went far beyond simple financial irresponsibility. Most significantly, Judge Chen said, her voice carrying moral authority that seemed to fill the courtroom, your fraud was designed to abandon your 8-year-old son while he believed you were dead. You allowed your child to grieve your supposed death, while you enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle in another state, funded by money that should have supported his basic needs. The emotional impact of Judge Chen's words was visible in David's reaction. His shoulders sagged and his head dropped as she described the psychological trauma his deception had inflicted on Tyler. For the first time since his arrest, David appeared to be confronting the human cost of his choices rather than just the legal consequences. Your Honor, Jennifer Hayes said, rising to address the court on David's behalf, my client recognizes the serious harm his actions caused and is prepared to make full restitution to all affected parties. He's requested that I emphasize his love for his son and his commitment to rebuilding their relationship through consistent support payments once he's completed his sentence. The public defender's statement sounded rehearsed and insufficient given the scope of David's deception. Claiming love for Tyler while having systematically abandoned him seemed particularly hollow in the formal setting of federal court, where legal obligations were treated as fundamental responsibilities rather than negotiable preferences. Judge Chen reviewed the pre-sentencing report prepared by federal probation officers who'd investigated David's background and current situation. The document included financial analysis showing David's capacity to pay child support, psychological evaluation of his motivations for fraud, and impact statements from the victims of his deception. Tyler's statement, prepared with my assistance, described the emotional trauma of believing his father had died and the ongoing confusion about why his daddy had disappeared from his life. Mr. Martinez, Judge Chen said, looking directly at David again, the pre-sentencing report indicates that you had sufficient income during your marriage to meet your child support obligations without experiencing financial hardship. Your decision to avoid these payments appears to have been motivated by selfishness rather than genuine inability to pay. The judge's assessment aligned with my own understanding of David's financial situation during our divorce proceedings. He'd fought the support amount not because he couldn't afford it, but because he wanted to maintain his lifestyle without the responsibilities that came with being a father. His elaborate fraud had been designed to preserve his personal comfort at Tyler's expense. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued, your creation of the David Walsh identity and your relationship with an innocent woman in Phoenix demonstrate a calculated willingness to deceive anyone who might threaten your fraudulent lifestyle. You manipulated Ms. Walsh's emotions and trust to provide cover for your criminal activities, making her another victim of your systematic dishonesty. Kimberly wasn't present in the courtroom, but Agent Santos had informed me that she'd provided a victim impact statement describing the emotional devastation of learning that her relationship had been built on lies. Her statement reportedly detailed the financial and emotional investment she'd made in a relationship with someone who didn't exist, creating trauma that would affect her ability to trust others in future relationships. The prosecution's sentencing recommendation called for 42 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, with mandatory restitution to all affected parties. The sentence reflected the sophisticated nature of David's fraud and the extensive harm he'd caused to multiple victims, particularly Tyler. Federal guidelines for his crimes supported the prosecution's recommendation, though Judge Chen had discretion to impose a longer sentence if she found aggravating factors in David's behavior. Mr. Martinez, Judge Chen said, giving David an opportunity to address the court before sentencing, do you have anything to say about your actions and their consequences? David stood slowly, consulting notes his attorney had prepared, while visibly struggling with the emotional weight of addressing his crimes publicly. Your Honor, I know that nothing I say can undo the harm I've caused to my son, to Ms. Walsh, and to everyone else affected by my actions. I made selfish choices that hurt the people I should have been protecting and supporting. His statement sounded genuine, though I couldn't determine whether his remorse was authentic or performative for the benefit of sentencing. The David I'd known during our marriage had been skilled at expressing regret when facing consequences, while continuing the same harmful behaviors once the immediate pressure was removed. I want Tyler to know that I love him, and that my abandonment was about my own failings as a father and as a person, David continued, his voice breaking slightly. He deserves better than what I've given him, and I hope that someday he can forgive me for the trauma I've caused through my selfish decisions. The reference to Tyler was emotionally manipulative, designed to generate sympathy from the court, while positioning David as a loving father who'd made mistakes, rather than someone who'd systematically abandoned his child to avoid responsibility. Judge Chen's expression suggested she wasn't impressed by his attempt to reframe child abandonment as parental love. Mr. Martinez, Judge Chen said after David completed his statement, your words about love for your son are contradicted by 8 months of behavior that demonstrated exactly the opposite. You chose to let Tyler believe you were dead, rather than face the financial responsibility of supporting him. That choice reveals your actual priorities regardless of what you claim to feel about him now. The judge's response eliminated any possibility that David's courtroom remorse would significantly influence his sentencing. Federal judges were experienced in distinguishing between genuine acceptance of responsibility and strategic expressions of regret designed to reduce punishment. This court sentences you to 48 months in federal prison, Judge Chen announced, imposing a sentence 6 months longer than the prosecution had recommended. Upon release, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation, during which you will make monthly restitution payments to satisfy your child support obligations, repay fraudulently obtained government benefits, and compensate other victims of your fraud. 48 months. 4 years during which David would have no income, no assets, and no ability to enjoy the comfortable lifestyle he'd prioritized over Tyler's needs. The sentence was severe enough to reflect the seriousness of his crimes, while ensuring he remained incarcerated long enough for Tyler to mature beyond the immediate trauma of his father's abandonment. Additionally, Judge Chen continued, all assets you acquired under the David Walsh identity are subject to immediate forfeiture to satisfy restitution obligations. Your wages upon release will be garnished at the maximum allowable rate until all victims are compensated fully. The asset forfeiture meant David's car, personal belongings, and any remaining savings from his Phoenix life would be liquidated to benefit Tyler and the other victims of his fraud. The comfortable lifestyle he'd built on lies would be systematically dismantled to repair the financial harm he'd caused through his deception. Finally, Judge Chen said, looking directly at David with an expression that suggested personal disappointment in his character, "Upon release, you are prohibited from creating new identities, opening accounts under false names, or engaging in any activities designed to hide your identity or financial obligations. Violation of these terms will result in additional federal charges and extended incarceration." The post-release restrictions would prevent David from attempting similar frauds in the future, while ensuring he remained visible to authorities responsible for monitoring his compliance with restitution payments. His days of disappearing from legal responsibilities were permanently ended. Federal marshals approached David as Judge Chen concluded the sentencing hearing, preparing to transport him back to detention pending assignment to a federal correctional facility. David looked back at the gallery one final time, his eyes finding mine with an expression that seemed to carry both resentment and resignation. I felt no satisfaction in his despair, but I experienced profound relief that Tyler's future was finally secured through comprehensive legal accountability. The weeks following David's sentencing brought a series of administrative procedures that transformed his punishment into practical benefits for Tyler. The asset forfeiture process liquidated David's Phoenix possessions systematically, with proceeds directed to a court-supervised account that would fund Tyler's support until David's release. The car he'd purchased as David Walsh, the expensive electronics, the country club membership, even his professional wardrobe, were converted into resources for the child he'd abandoned. More significantly, the Social Security Administration's recovery procedures had been completed, with the fraudulently obtained survivor benefits being repaid through asset seizure, while Tyler's eligibility for legitimate support programs remained intact. The government agencies David had tried to defraud had become allies in ensuring Tyler received the resources he needed for his education and development. Agent Santos called regularly during the post-sentencing period to update me on procedural developments and ensure I understood the various programs available to support Tyler's recovery from his father's abandonment. The FBI's Victim Services Division provided counseling resources and financial planning assistance to help families affected by white-collar crimes. Tyler and I were eligible for comprehensive support services that would continue throughout David's incarceration. The most unexpected aspect of the post-sentencing period was the media attention David's case received from family advocacy organizations and legal professionals interested in identity theft enforcement. His systematic fraud had created legal precedents that would be useful for prosecuting similar cases in the future, making Tyler's situation part of broader efforts to protect children from parental abandonment through fraudulent means. A victims' rights organization contacted me about using David's case as an educational example of how federal law enforcement could protect children from elaborate parental deception. They wanted to highlight the resources available to families dealing with deadbeat parents who attempted to hide through identity theft and document fraud. Tyler's story would help other children whose parents had chosen similar strategies to avoid their responsibilities. The educational value of our experience felt meaningful beyond the immediate benefits to Tyler. David's case demonstrated that parental responsibilities couldn't be avoided through sophisticated fraud, that government agencies had extensive resources for pursuing deadbeat parents across state lines and false identities. Other families facing similar abandonment would know that legal remedies existed and that children's rights were protected by federal law enforcement when local resources proved insufficient. 6 months after David's sentencing, I received the first restitution payment from the asset forfeiture process. The check represented more money than David had ever voluntarily contributed to Tyler's support. Ironic compensation for his attempt to avoid financial responsibility through elaborate deception. The funds were deposited into a court-supervised education account that would ensure Tyler's future opportunities remained secure regardless of David's post-release behavior. Tyler's adjustment to the truth about his father's deception had been gradual, but ultimately healthier than maintaining illusions based on lies. Child psychologists had advised honesty appropriate to his developmental level, helping him understand that his father's choices reflected personal failures rather than Tyler's worth as a person. The counseling process had been difficult but necessary for his emotional recovery. "Mom, will Dad ever come home?" Tyler asked one evening while we worked on homework together at our kitchen table. The question was inevitable, though I'd been dreading the complexity of explaining David's incarceration and future prospects. Your dad is in prison because he made very bad choices that hurt you and other people, I explained carefully. He'll be there for several years, and when he gets out, he'll have to follow rules about paying for your needs and not lying to people anymore. Tyler processed this information with the resilience children often display when dealing with adult complications. Did he really pretend to be dead so he wouldn't have to take care of me? He asked, demonstrating that he understood more about the situation than I'd sometimes given him credit for. Yes, sweetheart. Your dad made a very selfish choice because he didn't want to pay for things you needed like food and clothes and school supplies. But that choice was wrong, and now he has to face consequences for hurting you. Are we going to be okay without him? Tyler asked, the fundamental question that had worried him since learning the truth about David's abandonment. We're going to be better than okay, I said, with complete confidence. The court made sure that your dad's money will pay for everything you need, and I'm here to take care of you, no matter what happens. The conversation with Tyler represented a turning point in our recovery from David's betrayal. His questions demonstrated healthy processing of the trauma, while his acceptance of the situation showed resilience that would serve him well throughout his development. The truth about David's character was painful, but it was healthier than maintaining fantasies about a father who'd chosen abandonment over responsibility. The broader impact of David's case extended beyond our immediate family to influence legal procedures and social services designed to protect children from parental abandonment. Family court systems began implementing enhanced verification procedures for death certificates in child support cases, preventing future frauds similar to David's elaborate deception. Child support enforcement agencies developed new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths among obligated parents, ensuring that other children wouldn't experience the trauma Tyler had endured. Most significantly, federal prosecutors began treating sophisticated child support avoidance as serious white-collar crime worthy of comprehensive investigation and severe punishment. David's case had demonstrated that elaborate frauds designed to abandon children created extensive criminal liability that justified substantial law enforcement resources. Other deadbeat parents considering similar strategies would face the prospect of federal prosecution rather than simple civil enforcement. A year after David's sentencing, I received a letter from Kimberly Walsh expressing her sympathy for Tyler's situation and her gratitude that David's fraud had been exposed before their relationship progressed to marriage or children. She'd undergone extensive therapy to process the emotional trauma of learning that her boyfriend's entire identity had been fabricated, but she'd ultimately recovered with greater awareness of relationship red flags that might indicate deceptive behavior. Kimberly's letter included a small contribution to Tyler's education fund, money she described as her way of supporting the child who'd been harmed by the same fraud that had devastated her emotionally. Her gesture represented forgiveness and recognition that Tyler was an innocent victim, deserving support regardless of his father's actions. The connection between David's two primary victims had created an unexpected source of healing for both. The educational account established through David's asset forfeiture had grown substantially through investment management and continued restitution payments from his pre-incarceration assets. Tyler would have resources for college, vocational training, or entrepreneurial ventures that exceeded what David's regular child support payments would have provided over the same period. His father's attempt to avoid financial responsibility had actually created greater long-term security for his future. 2 years after David's sentencing, I received notification that he was eligible for early release through good behavior credits and federal prison programs. The prospect of his eventual return to supervised freedom felt surreal after becoming accustomed to his absence, but the comprehensive legal framework established during his prosecution ensured that his release wouldn't threaten Tyler's security or our family's stability. David's post-release obligations included mandatory employment in jobs that allowed wage garnishment, regular reporting to probation officers who would monitor his compliance with restitution payments, and absolute prohibition on identity changes or deceptive financial activities. His supervised freedom would be more restrictive than Tyler's childhood, ensuring that his attempt to escape parental responsibility resulted in permanent limitations on his personal autonomy. The woman who'd been devastated by her husband's fake death had been transformed through the process of pursuing accountability into someone capable of protecting her child through sophisticated legal strategies and multi-agency coordination. The skills I'd developed during David's prosecution had applications beyond our immediate situation, and I'd begun volunteering with family advocacy organizations to help other parents navigate complex enforcement procedures. Tyler's resilience and academic success despite his father's abandonment had become a source of inspiration for other children dealing with parental betrayal. His story demonstrated that fathers who chose to disappear couldn't define their children's potential or limit their future opportunities. The trauma David had inflicted through his elaborate deception had ultimately strengthened Tyler's character and clarified his understanding of responsibility and integrity. Looking back on the 2 years since discovering David's fraud, I realized that his betrayal had revealed capabilities and resources I'd never known existed. The passive wife who'd accepted his dismissive treatment had become someone formidable enough to coordinate federal prosecution and comprehensive asset recovery. David's assessment of my limitations had been as wrong as his belief that he could escape accountability through elaborate lies. Most importantly, Tyler had learned that people who harm others face consequences for their actions, that legal systems exist to protect children from parental selfishness, and that his father's failures didn't diminish his own worth or potential. The lessons David had tried to avoid teaching through his abandonment had been learned anyway through the process of holding him accountable for his choices. David's comfortable life in Phoenix had ended with federal agents at his door, while Tyler's future had been secured through the systematic application of legal remedies his father had thought he could avoid. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd been completely reconstructed with justice and accountability as their foundation, rather than lies and abandonment. The man who'd chosen to become legally dead rather than support his child had discovered that some responsibilities transcend any attempt to escape them through fraud or deception. Tyler's needs had been met not through David's voluntary compliance, but through comprehensive legal enforcement that transformed his father's assets into resources for the son he'd tried to abandon. Standing in our kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, watching Tyler work on a school project about family values and personal integrity, I felt the profound satisfaction of having protected him from the consequences of his father's selfishness, while teaching him that actions have consequences, regardless of how elaborate the attempts to avoid them might be. David had wanted to start fresh by faking his death. Instead, he'd created the circumstances that ensured Tyler would have a genuinely fresh start, funded by the liquidation of his father's fraudulent lifestyle and protected by legal structures that would prevent similar abandonment in the future. The victory was complete, comprehensive, and permanent. More importantly, it was righteous. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.